All the chief and I just want to do is figure out and make heads and tails of this whole thing and figure out, you know, where Kenny is. That's all.
He's in that bag.
He is in the bag.
I guess you had it coming. I guess you had it coming. If I had to choose a punishment for you, I guess you had it coming.
When was the last time that you saw Kenneth?
The last time I saw Kenneth was around February. I think it was 13th or 14th. I saw him at work. I just checked on him to make sure he's okay.
Does he have any disabilities at all?
Yes, he is. He was put through a neuropsychological test when he was a child, and he had a disability.
When is the last time you heard from him?
Probably February 17th.
Okay.
But I was getting quite concerned because he calls me every day. He finally gave me a call back. He was ranting and raving with his girlfriend, which was, I had no idea he had. She yelled, "Give me the phone." He said no, and she grabbed the phone and she called on the phone. And she said, "Leave the alone, you know, happy together. Who the do you think you are?" And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. I said, "You know who you talking to? You're talking to his mom." She hung up.
Who is she?
Well, I found out her name was Sheila LaBarre.
Sheila LaBarre is a 47-year-old widow, and she's inherited this farm property and this farmhouse from her late husband's estate, Dr. LaBarre. What the community does know about Sheila LaBarre is that since she became a widow, she has this revolving door of young males that come up to the property either to do work or for companionship.
LaBarre has set her sights on Kenneth County, who's only 24 at this time, and is somebody who's functioning perhaps like a younger individual, according to his mom, given his history of learning difficulties, etc. It is alarming. She's manipulative. She's every boy mom's nightmare.
Did you telephone him any other time after that?
The only time I telephoned my son, the number was changed. It was the number you're trying to call is no longer in service.
Is no longer in service. That was the next day?
That was the very next day.
Is this Sergeant Gallagher? I want to know how the effing police felt that they should come in my yard, and Mr. County does too. Do I have to pay your salary? Do I have to pay your salary? Am I a taxpayer? Yes, I am. I am one of the reasons you have a job. You're supposed to serve and protect me, sir. Right?
If you have a problem with what we did, your complaint is to the chief of police.
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you this. Anyone who comes in my yard, even under their official capacity, to look for Ken Shanty again, is going to be named in a lawsuit. We're all going to end up in court if Ken and I don't get left alone.
So the police have gone to check on Kenny, and they find him at LaBarre's property, and he's seemingly fine, and he's an adult, so there's really nothing to do about this. And they leave, but LaBarre is enraged by this. And so she contacts police and is threatening toward them. She's so grandiose and narcissistic in her comments. You know, don't I pay your salary, basically. You have a job because of me. It's just really a lack of respect for law enforcement and a sense of entitlement that's really shocking.
What is wrong with you? What is truly wrong with you? No. There's something severely mentally wrong with you. And you ask that. Why don't you just admit it?
In the room with me is a man, and I'm holding a revolver for my own personal self-defense. If I become deceased, let it be known that this individual has told me that his whore of a mother, in his own words, has raped, molested, and murdered various young children. You need to check and double-check and find out if he is involved in anyone who has expired. Bodies may have to be exhumed. And there is a possibility of a child that was raped, sodomized, and then murdered by a man by the name of Kenneth County.
Interestingly, she initiates a phone call to the Epping Police Department, lets them know about this recording she has, where she, self-appointed law enforcement, has begun to interrogate Kenneth County, and he has admitted, supposedly on this audio tape, to crimes that his mother has committed, as well as crimes he's committed. It should be noted and clearly stated that they have absolutely no information or credible data to support that there's any truth to the claims that LaBarre is making about Kenny County or his mother.
It's possible she's laying the groundwork that if it gets exposed that she was the one that killed Kenneth, that somehow that will be forgiven or justified because, you know, he looked like a pedophile. So I would be doing everybody a favor if I end up killing him.
When officers arrived at LaBarre's, they went past a gate blocking the public road leading up to her house. They walked past 2 burn piles in the front yard. In one of them, they saw bones sticking out. No one answered the door, so they kicked it in. But before they could get inside, LaBarre appeared, eventually kicking them out.
Sheila, look at me a minute. I'm just here because I am concerned. And if something happens, we will work through this. We will help you through this.
I don't know exactly what...
All the chief and I just want to do is figure out and make heads and tails of this whole thing and figure out, you know, where Kenny is. That's all.
He's in that bag.
He is in the bag?
I guess that looks human.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know what to tell you. What am I supposed to say?
Which bag, Sheila?
I cremated a rabbit.
You think he's in that bag?
I don't know that counts. It doesn't appear to be a rabbit, though.
Once the police explained to her that they're concerned about Kenny's whereabouts and they're just trying to locate him, what we see is a woman who is emotionally up and down. She doesn't know what to think about Kenny's disappearance, but when they ask her directly where he is, she says he's in that bag, as if it's a matter-of-fact thing. She talks about how she was cremating a rabbit. She has lots of rabbits and animals on the property, and when they pass away naturally, that's how she disposes of them. It seems reasonable that not only does she know where Kenny is, but that Kenny is not alive anymore. Most humans cannot fit in a retail bag. And so he's not only dead, but he may not even be in one piece.
I know what y'all are doing. Just shoot me. Because, man, I can't take any more stress.
Sheila, we're not here to accuse you of anything. We don't want to shoot you. All we know is Kenny County left here abruptly one day, and you don't know what happened from that point on.
I told Jody about that, but I knew he was going to leave because he'd been stealing money from me.
LaBarre is starting to play this cat and mouse game with the police. And that kind of zigzag approach to how somebody answers questions that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, is something we commonly see in psychopathic individuals.
When they speak to her, LaBar becomes hysterical and very defiant. And to me, this says she's lost control of the situation and she's now gonna try to use theatrical displays of emotion to kind of diffuse responsibility and control the conversation, because it's hard to continue with a line of questioning.
He was threatening to kill himself. He even threatened to set himself on fire. I didn't take him seriously.
So, now, when did he threaten to kill himself?
Many times.
He threatened to kill himself many times, and he threatened to burn himself?
Yes. He
well, let me
is
ask
a horrible person.
Okay.
He's horrible. I can't solve the mystery. I can only tell you what I can tell you. I just think die. I wish to God I dropped dead right now because I can't take
Sheila,
anymore.
where is right now? Do you wish you were with him?
No! What do you mean by that?
Well, you said that you said you wish you were dead, and I'm just trying to determine if he's dead or not.
I don't know. I'm not a DNA specialist. I don't know.
Is it going to take DNA to find out if Kenny's out in the bag?
Of course it will.
The lane leading to this Epping, New Hampshire farm has been blocked off with police tape since Saturday. The grounds turned into something that resembles a crime scene, all part of a massive effort to find 24-year-old Kenneth County. But New Hampshire authorities refuse to say whether they believe a crime has been committed here, despite the signs around the property owned by Sheila LaBar.
While detectives may be quite sure at this point that Sheila LaBar has likely killed him, and they likely have his human remains in this bag that was found on her property, it's not helpful to them unless they can get a confession from her.
That's okay.
He doesn't say
I'm Trooper
that.
Jill Rocky of the New Hampshire State Police. In the room with me is Richard Mitchell of the State Police and Sheila LaBar.
Kenneth, but he didn't want to be called Kenneth anymore. But I call Adam. I call him Adam.
You call him Adam? Okay. Who's Adam? Is he a tenant of yours? Or...
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Adam is Kenneth Michael County.
She immediately changes his name and kind of subsumes his identity and exerts full control over his movements, almost like when you get a pet, you name it. One thing that keeps coming back to me is that the rabbit trapped in a cage on the floor in her complete control is almost reminiscent of the MO of her crime, because she's trapping men in her property and then taking full control and ownership of them.
So when did you first meet him?
On February the 14th of 6 at the ashram. But first, originally, he hit me up with messages on a chat line.
So you met him on a chat line and then you met him at the ashram?
He instant messaged me.
Okay.
I had never heard him on the line before.
Okay.
I thought that was odd.
Yeah.
Because I've talked on the line for years.
Okay.
It's just harmless.
At one point, she takes the rabbit out of the cage and she has the rabbit on her lap and she's petting him and kind of treating him tenderly. And it's chilling because she's already mentioned that she's regularly incinerating rabbits. The rabbit in the room, this is almost as a metaphor for how she treats the men. This is very consistent with what we would see with a psychopathic individual who is often proud of their behavior and want people to take notice. All these behaviors are consistent with a lack of regard for human life and an absence of empathy towards others.
So did you arrange to meet him at the Ashworth, or did you just happen to meet him?
Pleaded with me.
Okay, and how did it go when you met him?
Well, my first thought was, when I looked at him, was pedophile.
Well, and how did you feel about Adam? I mean, you said that, you know, here's a guy that you're trying to help out.
And I did.
Yeah, who wants to sleep with a pedophile?
Nobody.
Exactly. So you must have been getting a little frustrated with him. I mean, he's kind of a pain in the ass, isn't he?
No.
Why?
Well, because I probably have a savior.
Okay, so you wanted to save him. How do you save a pedophile?
You can't.
So what do you do to him?
I wasn't going to give him my last name, LeBar. He wanted to be with me. He was running from death, running from a situation down there, which includes pedophilia.
Okay.
He's confessed this to me, that he has raped numerous children. And he was running from debt. But he didn't start in with this. Or obviously, I wouldn't have let him stay in my home.
Oh, yeah.
I just thought of something I haven't told anyone.
Okay.
What did you think?
They have to do with Adam? Can you tell us what they are?
He told me that he had been planning to rob me. And that he had, because I noticed somebody had been in my purse. And I said, Adam, are you going in a purse while I'm asleep? And he said, yes.
What we sometimes see more often in female psychopathic individuals is this willingness to turn on the waterworks, to start crying. It comes out of nowhere, and as spontaneously as it happens and as dramatic as it is, it spontaneously dries up just as much as a drought.
Okay. And so when Adam comes up here and he moves in up and Epping with you, did he work with you at all?
No, he didn't do anything except eat candy.
What kind of candy?
Well, anything. But I restricted that because I found out he was addicted to sugar, chocolate. He was jonesing from heroin, or what we call snack in the South. I've never done it.
At first, she's mentioning again pedophilia, but it doesn't seem like the investigators are biting, really. They don't seem to be that intrigued by that. So LeBar just keeps piling it on. Okay, he is going to rob her also. And by the way, he also does heroin. It's like everything she can do to create this impression of him. She's really trying to paint two pictures, I think, at once. And that is of him being a bad person and her being superior to him.
All right, what do you want to know?
Everything.
Well, he and I had discontinued sex for days.
Discontinued?
I wanted to. Okay. And basically, he's not turned on by women.
Okay.
It's got to be young girls or young boys or men.
Is consistent with a psychopath. She's lying and misrepresenting and being very deceitful in the delivery of information to paint the picture that, oh, this person deserved it, or to shift blame off of herself onto him and almost to paint the picture that maybe she's even a hero, that she was able to stop an individual from doing future crimes or engaging in kind of improper behaviors.
When was the last time you saw her, Adam?
It was either the 21st or the 22nd. I'm not sure.
Okay, so that's 3 or 4 days ago.
What did he say? Just what you can remember.
It's okay. He admitted to raping children, his family.
How did he start talking about this?
I noticed him looking at children. I in Walmart. His eyes will look at little girls, babies, diapers, anything, and he'll go,
How'd that make you feel when he did that?
upset, nauseous.
Did you say anything cool?
Yes. I said, you're a pedophile.
What did he say?
He's
So he asked you if you could save him? And you're shaking your head, yes?
I said, only God can save.
What we start to see with Labar is this over-focus or preoccupation with sex, with sexuality, and an interesting interaction between that and violence. And when we start to think about how those thoughts bleed together, the urges to be violent, and when she's talking about sexual topics, you have to wonder if there is a presence of sexual sadism or sadistic tendencies within this person.
Did you hurt Adam?
Financially. When I said I'm not supporting you anymore,
Right.
no more free rides. I'm not a magic carpet. I said, if my roots don't get done, I swear to God, I think I'm gonna pull my hair out and be bald. I said, my gay hairdresser's gonna flip when he sees me, and X30's gonna say, girl, what is wrong with you? You know.
But other than financially, did you hurt Adam?
Well, I told him that God would probably have him burn in hell.
Okay.
I said, you probably won't be in heaven with me, and he cried. So I heard. He even looks demonic. I have my card, there's only one. Let's go back in here, sweetheart. You want to go in? I know you don't. You don't understand. He's sorry about the cage being so dirty. He doesn't stay in this. He runs around the house dropping turds and everything.
Wow. You said tissue.
No, that doesn't bother me.
You sure?
I'm positive. It didn't bother me dealing with Kenneth.
Let me ask this, Sheila.
Yes, sir.
I was told that recently Adam ended up in some sort of a wheelchair.
Oh, okay.
Tell me about that.
Okay, all that was I said, do you want me to push you in the chair this time? And he said, yeah, I've always wanted to be pushed in a wheelchair.
Did he have any injuries on him?
Yes, he did, because of the pot that exploded. A glass pot. I don't remember what date.
The pot exploded at the house?
That is correct.
So you pushing him around in the wheelchair at Walmart?
But he didn't have to be.
It was just for fun.
Correct.
Kenneth and Sheila were seen at Walmart, and what witnesses describe is that Kenneth County looked green, he looked sick, frail, he was being pushed in a wheelchair by Labar, and he looked bruised and battered. She just laughed it off and minimized it and said, oh, we were just playing around with the wheelchair for fun. She becomes very glib about the whole thing. And what we don't ever see is any real emotion.
It paints the picture of some sadistic tendencies on Labar. It makes you wonder, what was she torturing him? What exactly was she doing to him? And then to parade him around at a Walmart or anywhere, it's pretty brazen. You know you're going out in public and there's surveillance video. But there is also this sense that she doesn't care.
Do you normally burn things in your yard like that?
Yeah, and usually in the burn pit. But in my yard, yes, I have often. Because
I was out there and you have a number of burn pits out there right now.
I sure do.
Yeah.
Because I went on a Cherokee burning rage.
Why?
Because I wanted to.
Authorities in Epping have confirmed that they've discovered human remains on the Labar property. A search of the burn piles has turned up hedge clippers and a knife.
What they also find inside the home are multiple sources of blood, some at different stages of decomposition, which suggests that clearly that home is a crime scene from multiple time periods, some of which clearly predate her contact with Kenneth County.
I mean, not all of this blood was fresh, which really begs the question that if she killed Kenneth County, then who else might she have killed?
It'd be premature at this point, given the stage of the investigation we're at now, to talk about foul play.
Need to let Mom go. You need to cut the cord. I want to. I'm going to cut it off. No. There's something severely mentally wrong with you. Now, I want to tell you something. I'm going to do something to your mother. I would like to beat the living hell out of her. Firstly, you like to both her eyes out. I need to know. See, you won't even touch me now. One mention of Mommy and you turn like ice for me. No. Are you Norman Bates? I am the only woman on this earth that's going to understand. Yes, you are. My life is valuable to me. Yours is a game. You're not talking. You don't care a word. I'm going to your goddamn head off.
In these recordings, it seems like LaBar is just torturing Kenneth County. He's answering these questions usually with one-word answers. It makes you wonder, is she standing over him with a weapon? She talks about how her life is valuable and his is just a game. So therefore, it really doesn't matter. And it exemplifies the psychopathic trait of having this callous disregard for humanity.
When we think of the grooming process, it involves an individual kind of establishing trust and a secure relationship with someone so that they feel that they're looking out for their best interest. In this case, we know that Kenny suffered from very significant cognitive deficits that interfered with his judgment and decision-making, and that he was very susceptible to the ideas of others and could be very easily manipulated.
In 2004, this tape was for my mother. You really messed me up. And if it wasn't for Sheila, I wouldn't know half the things I know.
What was known to authorities at that point is that Michael DeLodge had been missing for some time. He was homeless. He was recovering from some difficulties with mental illness and addiction. But the last time he was seen alive was on LaBar's property. They find audio recordings and video that LaBar has created of Michael DeLodge, and it seems eerily familiar to the audio that they listened to between LaBar and Kenneth County.
April the 3rd, 2004. This is an interview with Michael Todd DeLodge. A short, going bald, but not yet, going gray, tremendously fast, evil, brown or hazel-eyed, little munchkin who makes his living off women because you are attracted to what? What attracts you? What are you called? The point to the tape is to verify that Michael Delage was in fact investigated for child molestation. Okay. Now, are you guilty of the charges?
Yes.
We're seeing LaBar coerce or false confession out of Michael. We can only presume how she did that, but based on the physical injury she inflicted on Kenneth County, you can imagine that physical violence was involved.
This is where I live. This is what we do. We go around picking up sticks. And before you get into some tangent about my scratch on my face, this is how it happened.
It seems like she gets gratification from almost psychological torture and from harming other people. It seems to me that she equates love with sex and violence.
The pattern that starts to emerge with Sheila LaBar is a predatory offender who looks for particularly young and vulnerable males. She lures them in. When people think about sadistic offenders, most often they think about men, but the reality is paraphilic or deviant interests can pop up in men or women. And in the case of LaBar, based on what we know about her history, there are some good indications that she has a strange sexual arousal pattern that may have to do with violence towards men. And it's a slow buildup for her. It involves a coercive relationship and fear and threats. And when she's done with them, the ultimate climax for her, the ultimate moment of arousal for her is the process of killing them.
You hang up on me and you're going to be sorry. I suggest you don't hang up.
I'm sorry already.
I want what you signed, that my name would go on this deed. We agreed that I would...
Going on a deed unless I'm dead.
Dr. LaBar tells her, over my dead body is when you're going to get your name on the deed. She adopted and assumed his life and his home and his property, and shortly thereafter he died, and she ended up staking claim to his entire estate. Her arrogance and narcissism and belief that she's smarter than everyone else continues to be her guiding post.
Sheila LaBar presents as someone who's pretty cold and callous and manipulative.
It's really relevant here to consider the fact that the way that they met is through a call girl ad. LaBar was, I believe, in her 20s or 30s, and there was maybe a 40-year age difference in the two, and he was relatively wealthy. And you have to wonder, you know, was this a purposeful plan that was designed to entrap a wealthy man who could then provide for her and give her a sense of security? I see her as somebody who's always thinking out her next step of how can she take advantage of somebody to satisfy her own needs.
Interestingly enough, she was married to at least one other person while she was still in a relationship with Dr. LaBar. And her ex-husband that she was married to while she was still in a relationship with Dr. LaBar has come forward and said that she actually asked him to murder Dr. LaBar.
The human bones, blood, and DNA found at Sheila LaBar's Epping farm is known to belong to Michael Delage and Kenneth County. The fact that their bodies were burned is clear.
Investigators digging up the septic system uncovered more evidence, including toe bones that do not match either man's DNA. Sheila LaBar, the woman suspected in the murders of at least 2 missing men in Epping, New Hampshire, is in custody after authorities received a tip that she'd been spotted in Revere, Massachusetts. According to police, she had tried to change her appearance and was using an alias when she was finally caught.
There's a few things that you just can't get around.
What do you mean?
You know, and I know, and the chief knows, you killed that kid. You burnt your bed to destroy what? Evidence. Because what? There's blood on the bed.
Evidence?
Blood on the bed.
No.
And what did you tell Officer Wallace? Where's Kenny? He's in that bag. That's what you said. There is no way around it. You killed this kid.
I did
You
not
killed this
kill
kid,
him.
and
No.
you destroyed evidence by burning his body in the pit.
No. I did not burn him. I did not do anything to him.
Sheila, you could not have cared. If you cared about that kid right now, then you would tell me the truth.
I love him still.
I think her level of narcissism and arrogance is so significant that Sheila LaBarre really thought she was above the law. She would never get caught. If she just kept burning her victims, nobody would ever catch her. And what I think is more likely is that she has a sadistic preoccupation with sexuality, with child sexual molestation.
The LaBarre trial is not about whether she murdered Michael DeLoge in Kenneth County, but rather her state of mind at the time.
The jurors will decide, was LaBarre insane at the time she admittedly killed her boyfriends Kenneth County and Michael DeLoge?
I want you to think about a woman who truly believes she is an angel, a spirit, walking amongst the living, who has returned to earth for some special purpose.
Her attorney said LaBarre thought that being a notary public gave her special powers.
And she believes those powers gives her the ability to become judge, jury, and executioner.
You don't have to be afraid of me. God sent me to you to make you a better man. I'm an angel on earth.
LaBarre made statements that she was sent from God to be some sort of vigilante, angel, religious figure who was responsible for killing or for vetting out pedophiles. So that to me is a delusion that I think is born out of a serious mental illness. But ultimately, in doing these evaluations, we're looking for evidence to suggest that they knew what they were doing was wrong. She doesn't call the police. She lies, and she lies. She conceals evidence, and then she leaves the state, and that indicates that she very much knew that the behavior she engaged in was wrong.
We called her Crazy Sheila.
I think being sexually abused by her father created this fusion of love and hatred and sex that really plays out in her adulthood. I think she has some perversions, maybe even a paraphilia, where anything related to that content is arousing.
While we do sometimes see in cases of psychopathic individuals,
the first thing investigators believed they had found was a killer. The last thing they discovered was that they might have been chasing the wrong man all along. Between those two moments lies a story that has haunted Canada's justice system for decades, not because it ended with justice, but because it didn't. A young woman lost her life. A man lost nearly 17 years behind bars. And somewhere, hidden beneath thousands of pages of reports, forgotten witness statements, and evidence that would not come to light until decades later, the truth quietly waited while everyone believed the case had already been solved. On a cold November morning in 1995, the streets of Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, looked much like they always did before sunrise. The darkness lingered over empty parking lots, narrow alleyways, and rows of apartment buildings where most residents were still asleep. The late autumn air carried the damp smell of wet pavement and fallen leaves that had begun to decay after weeks of rain. It was the kind of morning that encouraged people to keep their heads down, their hands buried inside their coat pockets, and their thoughts focused only on getting through another ordinary day. For one woman, there would never be another ordinary day. She was 28 years old. Her name was Brenda Way. Before the sun climbed above the horizon, Brenda's body was discovered in a narrow area near Albro Lake Road. The violence of her death was impossible to ignore. Whoever attacked her had shown no hesitation. There was no opportunity for another conversation, another chance to walk away, another tomorrow waiting just beyond the darkness. Her life had ended in an act of brutal violence that immediately shocked investigators and devastated everyone who knew her. Police quickly promised the public they would find whoever had done this. They did find someone. Or at least they believed they had. Within days, attention turned toward a man named Glenn Assoon. He was no stranger to Brenda. The two had once shared a complicated relationship marked by arguments and emotional instability. Investigators learned about their history, spoke to witnesses who claimed they had seen them together shortly before Brenda's death, and examined Assoon's criminal past. Piece by piece, a narrative began taking shape. To detectives, it seemed to fit together well enough to point in one direction. It was a story that sounded convincing. Perhaps too convincing. Years later, that same story would begin to unravel. There were no fingerprints placing Glenn Assoon at the murder scene. No DNA connected him to the killing. No forensic evidence established that he had been present during Brenda's final moments. The prosecution's case relied largely upon witness testimony, assumptions drawn from previous conflicts, and a series of circumstantial pieces that, when assembled, appeared persuasive enough to convince a jury. In 1999, Glenn Assoon was convicted of murder. Many people believed the case was over. Justice, they thought, had been delivered. But justice built upon an incomplete foundation can stand for years before collapsing without warning. Behind closed filing cabinets, inside forgotten evidence rooms, and buried within investigative records that the defense would never see during trial, other information existed. Reports suggesting alternative suspects. Behavioral analyses indicating striking similarities between Brenda's murder and crimes committed by a convicted serial killer. Intelligence that raised uncomfortable questions about whether investigators had focused too narrowly on one suspect while overlooking another who may have posed an even greater danger. Those questions remained unanswered for years. Meanwhile, time moved on. Families grew older. Investigators retired. Lawyers came and went. The public forgot. Prison walls, however, have a different relationship with time. Days stretch into months. Months become years. Seasons pass unnoticed behind concrete and steel. For the person living inside those walls, every sunrise looks almost identical to the one before it. While Brenda Way's family continued living with unimaginable grief, Glenn Assoon continued insisting he had not murdered the woman he had once known. Almost no one listened. Cases involving violent crime often create a powerful emotional momentum. Once investigators settle upon a suspect, every new piece of information can begin reinforcing that conclusion. Witnesses remember details differently. Coincidences appear more meaningful. Contradictions become easier to explain away. Human beings naturally search for patterns, especially after tragedy. Sometimes those patterns reveal the truth. Sometimes they create an illusion. The Brenda Way murder would eventually become one of Canada's most controversial examples of how difficult it can be to distinguish between the two. Years after the conviction, independent reviews uncovered disturbing revelations. Important investigative material had not been disclosed to the defense. Information regarding additional suspects had remained hidden. Specialized criminal behavior analysis had pointed toward another possible offender whose history of violence bore unsettling similarities to Brenda's death. His name was Michael Wayne McGray. By the time those discoveries surfaced, countless lives had already been permanently altered. Brenda could never come home. Her family could never ask her what happened during her final hours. No courtroom ruling could restore the birthdays she never celebrated or the future she never had the opportunity to build. At the same time, Glenna Soon had already spent nearly 2 decades imprisoned for a crime that Canada's own justice system would eventually acknowledge had not been proven beyond reasonable doubt. When his conviction was finally overturned in 2019, many headlines focused on the extraordinary miscarriage of justice. They spoke about the years stolen from an innocent man. They questioned investigative failures, prosecutorial decisions, and systemic problems inside the criminal justice process. Those headlines were important. But another truth remained. Even after Glenna Soon walked free, Brenda Way's murder was still unsolved. The woman whose death had triggered one of the country's most significant wrongful conviction cases still had no officially identified killer. Somewhere between the search for justice and the certainty of a conviction, the original victim had almost disappeared from public conversation. That is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. This is not simply the story of a murder investigation. It is the story of 2 lives destroyed in different ways by the same crime. One ended in a dark alley during the early hours of a November morning. The other disappeared slowly behind prison walls while insisting that the police had arrested the wrong man. And beyond both stories lies an even larger question, one that reaches far beyond Halifax, beyond Nova Scotia, and beyond Canada itself. What happens when a criminal investigation becomes so certain of its answer that it stops asking questions? Because the most dangerous mistake in any murder investigation is not failing to find a suspect. It is believing you've found the right one before the truth has had the chance to speak. Tonight, we return to Halifax in the autumn of 1995. We will retrace Brenda Way's final known movements, examine the investigation that convinced a jury, uncover the evidence that remained hidden for decades, and follow the extraordinary path that transformed a closed murder case into one of the most troubling wrongful conviction cases in Canadian history. But above everything else, we will remember the woman whose name began this entire story, because before this became a legal controversy, before it became a national debate about disclosure failures and investigative bias, it was the story of a 28-year-old woman whose life ended violently, leaving behind questions that, more than 30 years later, still have no definitive answers. November arrives differently in Atlantic Canada than it does in most places. It does not announce itself with the dramatic arrival of snowstorms or frozen landscapes. Instead, it settles quietly over the coast, bringing shorter afternoons, damp sidewalks, leafless branches, and an unmistakable feeling that another long winter is only weeks away. The wind carries the scent of the Atlantic Ocean through neighborhoods where generations of families have built their lives, and as daylight fades earlier each evening, familiar streets begin to look unfamiliar beneath the glow of orange streetlights. In 1995, Halifax and its neighboring city of Dartmouth represented 2 sides of the same growing community. Separated by the harbor yet deeply connected by bridges, ferries, and shared histories, the cities reflected both prosperity and struggle. Government offices, naval facilities, universities, and small businesses created opportunities for thousands, while other neighborhoods quietly battled unemployment, addiction, unstable housing, and violent crime that rarely reached national headlines. Like many Canadian cities during the mid-1990s, Halifax was experiencing social changes that affected those living on its margins far more than those whose lives remained comfortably predictable. Every city has places that tourists photograph and places they never see. Albro Lake Road was not a destination visitors came looking for. It was simply another road woven into the fabric of Dartmouth, surrounded by apartment buildings, convenience stores, aging commercial properties, and residential streets where ordinary people carried on with ordinary routines. During daylight hours, traffic flowed steadily. Children walked home from school. People waited at bus stops while clutching coffee cups against the cold wind. Delivery trucks came and went without attracting attention. To someone passing through, there was nothing especially remarkable about the area. Yet beneath its routine appearance existed a different rhythm known mainly to those who spent enough time there. Some residents struggled with unstable employment. Others battled addictions that consumed nearly every aspect of their daily lives. Small arguments erupted outside apartment buildings before disappearing as quickly as they had begun. Friendships formed and dissolved with equal speed. Police officers became familiar faces rather than strangers because they were called to the same neighborhoods again and again. For many living there, survival often required navigating complicated relationships built upon necessity rather than trust. It was within this environment that Brenda Way lived much of her life. The surviving public record offers only fragments of who Brenda truly was. Court documents, investigative reports, and newspaper articles naturally concentrated on the circumstances surrounding her death rather than the years that came before it. Like so many homicide victims, her identity gradually became compressed into a collection of legal facts. Her name appeared alongside words such as victim, homicide, evidence, investigation, and witness testimony. The ordinary moments that make up an entire human life rarely survive inside criminal case files. But every victim existed long before the investigation began. Long before detectives assembled timelines or interviewed witnesses, Brenda had experienced birthdays, friendships, disappointments, hopes, and countless ordinary mornings that no official document would ever record. She laughed with people she trusted. She argued with those she loved. She made decisions, some wise and others impulsive, just as every person does. Her life, like many lives touched by hardship, was neither entirely tragic nor entirely peaceful. It existed somewhere between those extremes. People who knew Brenda often described her life as complicated. Complicated can mean many things. It can mean financial instability that never quite disappears. It can mean relationships that repeatedly promise new beginnings before collapsing into familiar patterns. It can mean trying to outrun yesterday while tomorrow refuses to arrive. For Brenda, life appeared to involve constant movement through social circles where people often knew one another through overlapping friendships, temporary relationships, and shared struggles. In communities where resources are limited and opportunities scarce, lives become deeply interconnected. News travels quickly. Arguments rarely remain private. Everyone seems to know someone who knows someone else. That closeness can provide support. It can also become dangerous. Among the people Brenda knew was a man named Glenn Assoon. Their relationship would eventually dominate nearly every discussion surrounding the murder investigation, yet before detectives focused on him as a suspect, he occupied a far more ordinary role in Brenda's life. They had known one another personally. Their relationship had been romantic at one point, though by late 1995 it had become increasingly strained. Public records indicate that disagreements between them had occurred, and those conflicts would later become central to the prosecution's theory. Relationships rarely end as cleanly as people imagine. Conversations continue after breakups. Old emotions linger beneath ordinary exchanges. Arguments that seem insignificant one week may later be remembered as important after tragedy changes their meaning. Investigators would eventually reconstruct these interactions in extraordinary detail, searching each disagreement for signs of escalating violence. Yet at the time they occurred, they were simply moments inside a relationship that, like countless others, had become emotionally unstable. Beyond Brenda's personal relationships, Halifax itself provided the backdrop for a criminal justice system operating under the investigative standards of the mid-1990s. DNA technology existed but remained far less advanced than it would become in later decades. Digital surveillance was minimal. Mobile phones were uncommon compared to today, and location data capable of reconstructing a person's movements simply did not exist for most people. Detectives depended heavily upon eyewitness testimony, handwritten reports, interviews, physical evidence recovered from crime scenes, and the experience of seasoned investigators who learned to trust their instincts. Those instincts often solved crimes. Sometimes they also led investigations in the wrong direction. Confirmation bias was not yet discussed publicly as often as it is today. Investigators were trained to identify suspects, build theories, and seek evidence that either confirmed or contradicted those theories. Ideally, every possibility received equal consideration. In reality, once attention settled upon one individual, every subsequent discovery could become filtered through that assumption. No detective begins an investigation intending to make a mistake. Mistakes often emerge through ordinary human psychology rather than malicious intent. An argument becomes evidence of motive. A prior criminal record becomes evidence of character. A witness remembers seeing two people together, and suddenly that memory becomes more significant than uncertainty itself. Over time, isolated facts begin forming what appears to be a complete picture. Whether that picture reflects reality is another question entirely. The neighborhood surrounding Albro Lake Road reflected many of the broader social issues confronting Atlantic Canada during that period. Economic uncertainty had left lasting effects on working-class communities. Some residents moved frequently between temporary apartments, shelters, or friends' homes. Addiction services remained limited. Mental health resources were far less accessible than they are today. Individuals living on society's margins often became vulnerable not only to violence but also to being overlooked when they disappeared or when they needed help. That vulnerability would become one of the quiet themes running beneath Brenda's story. People living difficult lives are sometimes remembered only for those difficulties. They deserve better than that. Whatever challenges Brenda faced, none of them diminished the value of her life. None justified the violence that would ultimately end it. None made her death any less deserving of a complete, careful, and unbiased investigation. As autumn deepened during November 1995, residents prepared for another maritime winter. Storefronts displayed early holiday decorations. Families discussed upcoming gatherings. Children counted the weeks until Christmas. Most people never imagined that within their own community a homicide investigation was about to begin, one that would continue casting shadows over Canada's justice system for decades. The city itself carried on as cities always do. Buses followed their schedules. Ships crossed the harbor. Office workers hurried through chilly mornings with collars pulled high against the wind. Police officers responded to routine calls, unaware that one case would eventually challenge assumptions about disclosure, investigative objectivity, and the frightening possibility that solving a crime too quickly can sometimes be nearly as damaging as failing to solve it at all. Looking back now, knowing everything that would unfold over the next 30 years, it is tempting to search this ordinary landscape for signs that something extraordinary was approaching. But history rarely announces itself in advance. The streets looked the same. The apartment buildings stood unchanged. People greeted neighbors exactly as they had the day before. The future remained invisible to everyone living inside that present moment. Somewhere within those familiar streets, Brenda Way was continuing to live her everyday life without knowing that her name would one day appear in legal textbooks, investigative reviews, and discussions about one of Canada's most significant wrongful conviction cases. She could not know that the circumstances surrounding her death would eventually expose uncomfortable questions reaching far beyond one homicide investigation. She could not know that decades later, journalists, lawyers, retired detectives, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens would continue asking the same question that investigators believed they had answered in the very beginning. Who really killed Brenda Way? That question would shape every chapter of this story, but before suspicion, before courtrooms, before appeals, and before the painful realization that justice had gone terribly wrong, there was simply a city preparing for winter and a woman living another ordinary week in Halifax. Unaware that history was quietly moving toward her with every passing hour. Every homicide investigation begins by asking the same question. Who was this person? It sounds simple, yet the answer is rarely found inside police reports or courtroom transcripts. Those documents record evidence, timelines, witness statements, and forensic conclusions. They preserve the final chapter with remarkable precision while often leaving the earlier chapters scattered across fading memories, family photographs, and conversations that were never meant to become part of a criminal case. For Brenda Way, that imbalance is especially striking. Today, her name is most often associated with one of Canada's most controversial wrongful conviction cases. Legal scholars discuss disclosure failures. Investigative journalists examine the prosecution of Glenn Assoon. Criminal justice experts debate the systemic mistakes that allowed an innocent man to spend years behind bars before his conviction was overturned. Those conversations are important because they reveal weaknesses within the justice system that should never be ignored. But before Brenda became the center of a legal controversy, She was simply a 28-year-old woman living in the Halifax area, navigating the ordinary and extraordinary challenges that shaped her daily life. The surviving public record tells us only fragments of who she was. It indicates that her life was complicated, that she was familiar with the Dartmouth neighborhood around Albro Lake Road, and that she knew people whose own lives were marked by instability. Those fragments do not define her. They merely provide the setting in which the final days of her life unfolded. Like countless others living on the economic margins during the mid-1990s, Brenda's world was likely measured less by long-term certainty than by immediate concerns. Stable housing, dependable income, healthy relationships, and personal safety are luxuries that many people take for granted until they become difficult to maintain. In communities facing persistent hardship, life often revolves around making it through another week rather than planning years into the future. That reality should never be mistaken for a lack of dignity. People living difficult lives still celebrate birthdays. They still laugh with friends, remember favorite songs, look forward to familiar faces, and imagine better days ahead. Their struggles do not erase their humanity. Unfortunately, homicide victims whose lives include poverty, addiction, unstable relationships, or previous encounters with the justice system are sometimes remembered almost exclusively through those hardships. Public perception can become shaped by labels instead of lives. Once that happens, the individual slowly disappears behind simplified descriptions that never tell the complete story. Brenda deserves to be remembered as more than the circumstances surrounding her death. She was someone's daughter. She was someone known within her community. She had relationships that mattered to her, even when they became complicated. She occupied a place within the lives of people who would forever remember the day they learned she was gone. One of those complicated relationships was with Glenn Assoon. Public records establish that Brenda and Glenn had known each other personally and had previously been romantically involved. Their relationship had experienced conflict, and witnesses later described disagreements between them. Those documented facts would eventually become central to the police investigation. Relationships often leave emotional footprints that remain long after they formally end. Two people who once shared affection can continue crossing paths, speaking to mutual acquaintances, arguing over unresolved issues, or attempting reconciliation before separating once again. Such interactions are common and, by themselves, reveal very little about what may happen later. After Brenda's death, however, every known interaction between the two would be re-examined through the lens of homicide. Conversations that once seemed ordinary became potential evidence. Arguments that might otherwise have been forgotten suddenly appeared significant. Witnesses were asked to remember details from days or weeks earlier, searching their memories for moments that could help explain an unimaginable crime. This transformation is one of the most difficult aspects of any murder investigation. Once a tragedy occurs, the past itself seems to change. Events that originally carried little meaning begin acquiring enormous importance simply because investigators now know how the story ended. Yet Brenda's life extended beyond any single relationship. She moved through neighborhoods where many people knew one another by sight, if not by name. Familiar faces appeared at local businesses, apartment buildings, bus stops, and gathering places. In communities like these, personal networks often overlap. Someone who knows one individual is likely connected, directly or indirectly, to several others. News spreads quickly. Rumors spread even faster. For investigators, such close-knit environments present both opportunities and challenges. Witnesses may possess valuable information because they regularly observe one another's routines. At the same time, memories become influenced by conversations between neighbors, assumptions about personal histories, and the natural tendency to interpret events after the fact. Long before detectives began interviewing witnesses, Brenda was simply another person moving through this familiar landscape. She could not have imagined that strangers would one day reconstruct her final known movements with extraordinary precision. She could not know that lawyers would spend decades examining testimony connected to her final hours. She could not know that journalists would later revisit her case, not because her killer had been found, but because the man convicted of her murder would eventually be declared the victim of a profound miscarriage of justice. For Brenda's loved ones, however, those future developments could never replace what had been taken away. Wrongful conviction cases often focus, understandably, on the innocent person who was imprisoned. That suffering is real and deserves recognition. Yet another family continues living with an entirely different loss. They still wake each day knowing that someone they loved was murdered. They still live without definitive answers. If the wrong individual was convicted, then the person responsible remained unidentified while years passed without accountability. That painful reality sits at the heart of Brenda's story. She became both the victim of a violent crime and, in many respects, a victim of an investigation that may have narrowed its focus too quickly. Neither outcome honors her memory. A homicide investigation exists to discover the truth, wherever it leads. If the truth remains hidden because investigators stopped asking difficult questions, then justice remains incomplete for everyone involved. As the autumn of 1995 progressed, Brenda continued living within a city preparing for another maritime winter. The days grew shorter. Temperatures dropped a little more each week. Jackets replaced lighter clothing. Evening darkness arrived before many people had finished work. Nothing about the changing seasons suggested that history was quietly approaching. Around Halifax and Dartmouth, ordinary life continued uninterrupted. Parents hurried children home before dinner. Store owners locked their doors at closing time. Friends arranged to meet one another later in the evening. Traffic crossed the bridges linking the two cities while ferries carried passengers back and forth across the harbour. Every person moved through the day believing tomorrow would arrive much like today. Brenda was no different. Whatever plans she held for the coming days, whatever conversations remained unfinished, whatever hopes she still carried into the future, they belonged to a life that had not yet reached its final chapter. The tragedy of violent crime is not measured only by the moment violence occurs. It is measured by every ordinary moment that will never happen afterward. The next birthday. The next family gathering. The unexpected reunion with an old friend. The quiet evening that never arrives because time has suddenly stopped for one person while continuing relentlessly for everyone else. As we move closer to the events of November 11, 1995, it becomes important to remember this distinction. Brenda Way is not merely the first name in a murder investigation or the central figure in a legal controversy. She is the reason this story exists at all. Every court hearing, every appeal, every investigative review, every newspaper headline, and every public debate traces back to the irreversible loss of one human life. That perspective should never be forgotten. Because even after decades of legal proceedings, public scrutiny, and official reviews, one fact has never changed. A 28-year-old woman left home during an ordinary November weekend and never returned. The justice system would spend decades debating who was responsible. Her family spent those same decades living with the certainty that no legal decision could undo what happened. And somewhere within that painful divide between unanswered grief and uncertain justice, Brenda Way's story continues to remind us that every unresolved homicide is more than an unsolved mystery. It is an unfinished life whose ending still demands the truth. Saturday, November 11, 1995, began like countless other late autumn weekends across Halifax and Dartmouth. The air carried the familiar chill that signaled winter was approaching, and daylight seemed to disappear almost as quickly as it arrived. By evening, the streets were illuminated by rows of amber streetlights reflecting off damp pavement, while people drifted between homes, restaurants, neighborhood gathering places, and local businesses. Few could have imagined that before the following sunrise, one violent act would begin a chain of events that would echo through Canada's justice system for decades. The publicly established timeline surrounding Brenda Way's final hours is incomplete. That uncertainty would become one of the defining characteristics of the investigation. Investigators were able to determine that Brenda was alive on the evening of November 11 and was seen in the Dartmouth area. Witnesses later provided accounts placing her within the community during those final hours. As with many homicide investigations, detectives attempted to reconstruct every movement, every conversation, and every encounter that might help explain what happened next. Yet even after years of investigation, appeals, and official reviews, many moments from that night remain unknown. No complete record exists describing Brenda's final thoughts. No reliable witness followed every step she took. No surveillance cameras documented her journey. Instead, investigators were left assembling a timeline from individual observations, each one offering only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Some witnesses recalled seeing Brenda earlier in the evening. Others remembered later encounters. Like all human memory, these recollections were influenced by time, perspective, and the knowledge that something terrible had happened afterward. Investigators carefully compared statements, searching for consistency while attempting to establish the sequence of events leading toward the early hours of November 12. Among those statements were accounts suggesting that Brenda and Glenn Assoon had been seen together not long before her death. Those observations would eventually become some of the most influential evidence presented against him. At the time, however, they represented only one portion of an investigation that had barely begun. As darkness settled across Dartmouth, neighborhoods grew quieter. Businesses gradually closed their doors. Residential streets emptied as families returned indoors to escape the cold. Traffic became lighter with each passing hour. The ordinary sounds of the city faded until only the occasional passing vehicle disturbed the silence. Somewhere within that increasingly quiet landscape, Brenda's life entered its final chapter. Exactly where the fatal confrontation began remains uncertain. Publicly available records do not establish every location she visited during the final hours before her body was discovered. Investigators would later develop theories based upon witness testimony, physical evidence, and their interpretation of the available facts, but the complete sequence of events has never been reconstructed with absolute certainty. What is known is devastating enough. During the early hours of November 12, Brenda suffered a violent attack involving a sharp-edged weapon. The injuries she sustained proved fatal. The nature of the assault immediately indicated that investigators were dealing with an intentional homicide rather than an accident or a random misfortune. Violent crimes often leave behind more questions than answers. How long did the encounter last? Did Brenda know the person responsible? Was there an argument beforehand? Did anyone nearby hear or see something without realizing its importance? Those questions would dominate the investigation, yet many would remain unanswered. Because no verified eyewitness observed the attack itself, detectives had to work backward from the aftermath. Every recovered piece of evidence, every interview, and every forensic examination became an attempt to bridge the gap between Brenda's last confirmed sighting and the discovery that would follow only hours later. The emotional weight of those missing hours cannot be overstated. Within every homicide case exists a period investigators sometimes refer to as the silent gap, the stretch of time during which the victim is no longer visible to the outside world and the truth belongs only to the victim and the person responsible. Unless compelling evidence survives, that silence can persist for decades. Brenda's case would become defined by exactly such a silence. As investigators later reconstructed possible scenarios, one fact became increasingly important in their minds. Brenda and Glenn Assoon had experienced previous conflicts. Their relationship had deteriorated over time, and witnesses described disagreements between them. To detectives attempting to identify a suspect quickly, that history appeared significant. But history and proof are not the same thing. Relationships can provide motive in theory while revealing nothing about what actually occurred on a specific night. That distinction would later become one of the central issues surrounding the case. During those early hours, however, detectives did not yet know how controversial their investigation would eventually become. They were responding to the murder of a young woman whose final hours remained largely hidden. Every minute that passed increased the urgency to identify whoever had committed such a brutal act. For Brenda's family and friends, the tragedy unfolded without warning. Somewhere, while they slept or continued with their own routines, they remained completely unaware that their lives had already changed forever. They did not yet know that conversations they had shared with Brenda in previous days would become precious memories. They could not know that investigators would soon arrive with devastating news no family is ever prepared to receive. The ordinary rhythm of life continued for everyone else. Morning approached. People prepared for work. Coffee makers switched on. Newspapers were delivered to front steps. Children slept peacefully in their bedrooms. Nothing in those ordinary routines reflected the extraordinary violence that had occurred only hours earlier. One of the most unsettling aspects of homicide investigations is this contrast between private tragedy and public normality. Entire communities continue functioning exactly as they always have while, hidden within a single location, one irreversible event has already altered countless lives. By the time daylight returned to Dartmouth, Brenda Way could no longer tell investigators what had happened. Her voice had been permanently silenced. From that moment forward, others would speak on her behalf. Police officers would interpret evidence. Witnesses would recall memories. Lawyers would argue competing theories. Experts would analyze forensic findings. Judges would issue legal rulings. Jurors would weigh testimony. Appeal courts would later reconsider those same conclusions. Yet the one person who knew exactly what happened during those final moments would never have the opportunity to describe them. That absence would shape every stage of the case. As the investigation unfolded, detectives naturally searched for a coherent explanation. Human beings are uncomfortable with uncertainty, particularly when confronted by acts of extreme violence. An unsolved homicide demands answers, and investigators carry the immense responsibility of finding them before evidence disappears and memories fade. Time is rarely on their side. Witnesses forget details. Weather alters crime scenes. Physical evidence deteriorates. Rumors spread through communities, influencing later recollections. Every hour becomes increasingly valuable. Those realities created enormous pressure from the very beginning. The murder of Brenda Way was not merely another police file. It represented a violent crime that understandably demanded immediate action. Officers worked to establish timelines, interview witnesses, and determine who had last been with Brenda. Their efforts reflected both professional obligation and genuine determination to identify the person responsible. Looking back decades later, with the benefit of information unavailable to investigators at the time, it is easy to criticize decisions that seemed reasonable during those first frantic days. But hindsight does not erase the complexity of those initial hours. Detectives were attempting to solve a murder with incomplete information. The tragedy emerged later when incomplete information gradually became treated as complete certainty. On that November night, however, none of those future controversies had yet appeared. There was only a murdered woman. A grieving family that had not yet received the full weight of unimaginable news. A community about to awaken to headlines describing a brutal killing close to home. And investigators standing at the beginning of a case they believed would eventually lead them to the truth. Instead, it would lead them into one of the most consequential wrongful conviction cases in Canadian history. But before courtrooms, appeals, and decades of legal scrutiny, everything depended upon understanding what had happened during those missing hours between Brenda's final confirmed sightings and the discovery that would forever divide this story into two separate timelines. One timeline belonged to Brenda Way, ending in violence before dawn on November 12, 1995. The other belonged to the investigation itself, a journey that would begin with confidence, continue through conviction, and eventually force an entire justice system to confront the unsettling possibility that solving a case is not always the same as finding the truth. The first officers who arrived understood immediately that they were no longer responding to a routine call. Every experienced investigator recognizes that moment when an ordinary shift changes without warning. A location that only hours earlier had been another quiet corner of Dartmouth had suddenly become a homicide scene, and from that point forward, every decision made within the next few hours could influence the investigation for years to come. Brenda Way's body was discovered during the early morning hours of November 12, 1995, in the vicinity of Albro Lake Road in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. The location itself was not isolated wilderness, nor was it a busy public square constantly filled with people. It was the kind of urban environment where activity fluctuated dramatically depending on the time of day. During daylight, nearby residents and passing traffic might have made the area seem entirely ordinary. Before sunrise, however, The streets were quiet enough that even small disturbances could disappear unnoticed into the darkness. The discovery immediately transformed the area into a protected crime scene. Uniformed officers established boundaries to preserve whatever physical evidence might still remain. Every footprint, discarded object, stain, or disturbance in the surrounding environment had to be treated as potentially significant. Crime scene investigators understood that they were working against time. Weather, passing pedestrians, vehicles, and even the investigators themselves could unintentionally destroy fragile evidence if proper procedures were not followed. As daylight slowly began replacing darkness, the scene revealed the unmistakable signs of a violent homicide. Publicly available records establish that Brenda had suffered fatal injuries inflicted by a sharp-edged weapon. The nature of those injuries immediately indicated that investigators were dealing with an intentional act of lethal violence rather than an accidental death. For detectives, the first hours at a homicide scene involve asking dozens of questions simultaneously. Was this the primary crime scene, or had Brenda been attacked elsewhere before being left here? Had the killer remained in the area after the assault? Were there signs of a struggle extending beyond the immediate location? Could nearby residents have seen or heard anything unusual during the night? Every observation mattered because each one had the potential to narrow the timeline or identify the person responsible. Forensic specialists documented the scene methodically. Photographs preserved every visible detail before anything could be moved. Measurements recorded the exact positions of physical evidence. Investigators searched the surrounding area for anything that might connect the victim to another individual or reconstruct the events leading to her death. In 1995, crime scene investigation relied heavily upon careful observation and meticulous documentation. DNA analysis was available but far less comprehensive than the forensic capabilities investigators possess today. Digital surveillance cameras were uncommon. Mobile phone location records did not exist in the way modern investigators now depend upon. Consequently, physical evidence recovered directly from the scene carried extraordinary importance. Every recovered item represented a possible lead. Every missing item represented another unanswered question. One conclusion, however, became apparent very early. Despite the brutality of the attack, investigators did not recover forensic evidence that conclusively identified the killer. That fact would later become one of the most important aspects of the entire case. As laboratory examinations continued, investigators found no DNA placing Glenn Assoon at the crime scene. No fingerprints directly connected him to the killing. No forensic finding established beyond doubt that he had physically been present when Brenda was attacked. Those absences did not initially eliminate him as a suspect. Instead, detectives began searching elsewhere for answers. While forensic teams continued processing the scene, homicide investigators shifted their attention toward reconstructing Brenda's final movements. Identifying the last people known to have seen a victim alive is among the earliest priorities in almost every homicide investigation. Detectives interviewed acquaintances, friends, and anyone who might help establish where Brenda had been during the evening of November 11th. The interviews gradually produced a timeline that investigators believed was becoming clearer. Witnesses described seeing Brenda in Dartmouth during the evening. Some reported seeing her with Glenn Assoon. Others spoke about the history of conflict between the two. Viewed independently, each statement represented only one person's recollection. Viewed collectively, detectives began seeing a pattern. Patterns are powerful. They allow investigators to transform isolated facts into coherent narratives. Yet patterns also carry risks. Once a particular explanation begins appearing plausible, new information may naturally be interpreted in ways that reinforce that explanation rather than challenge it. This phenomenon was not unique to the Brenda Way investigation. It has appeared in criminal investigations around the world whenever investigators, often acting in good faith, become increasingly confident that they have identified the correct suspect. Meanwhile, Brenda's family faced an entirely different reality. Before legal theories, forensic analysis, or investigative strategies could even be discussed, they had to confront an unimaginable loss. Someone they loved had been killed. Every conversation with police officers became filled with questions that no family ever wants to ask. What happened? Did she suffer? Who would do this? Would they ever be caught? Those questions rarely receive immediate answers. Instead, families often enter a painful period defined by waiting. Waiting for updates. Waiting for laboratory results. Waiting for investigators to uncover new information. Waiting for arrests that may or may not come. For Brenda's loved ones, that waiting had only begun. As investigators expanded their search beyond the immediate crime scene, they examined Brenda's recent relationships, daily routines, and known associates. Homicide detectives understand that victims frequently know the individuals responsible for their deaths. Consequently, investigators often begin by examining personal connections before considering less familiar possibilities. Within that framework, Glenn soon naturally drew significant attention. He had previously been in a relationship with Brenda. Witnesses described disagreements between them. He possessed a criminal history that investigators considered relevant. Taken together, these factors appeared to justify intensive scrutiny. Yet another equally important reality remained. The physical evidence itself did not establish that Glenn Assoon had committed the murder. This distinction became increasingly significant as the investigation progressed. Instead of a forensic case anchored by biological evidence, detectives were gradually assembling what legal professionals describe as a circumstantial case. Circumstantial evidence can be powerful. Many murder convictions rest upon carefully connected indirect evidence rather than eyewitness testimony or DNA. But circumstantial cases also require investigators to guard carefully against assumptions filling gaps where proof does not yet exist. Every unanswered question must remain unanswered until evidence supplies the answer. If assumptions arrive first, investigations can slowly begin moving toward conclusions rather than discoveries. Years later, independent reviews of the Brenda Way investigation would raise precisely those concerns. But during those first days, detectives remained focused on solving a recent homicide under considerable public pressure. News of Brenda's murder spread quickly throughout the Halifax region. Communities naturally react with particular concern when violence appears sudden and seemingly unexplained. Residents wonder whether the attack was targeted or random. Parents become more cautious. Rumors circulate through neighborhoods, workplaces, and local gathering places. Every new piece of information attracts attention. Every reported sighting generates speculation. Every name associated with the investigation becomes the subject of discussion. Within that atmosphere, detectives continued collecting witness statements while forensic specialists completed laboratory examinations of available evidence. The investigation appeared to be moving steadily forward. Behind the scenes, however, important limitations already existed. Without direct forensic evidence identifying the killer, the case increasingly depended upon human memory. Memory is an extraordinary ability. It is also imperfect. People unintentionally confuse dates. They merge separate conversations into one. They become more confident about uncertain recollections after repeatedly discussing events with others. Psychological research conducted over subsequent decades would demonstrate how easily memory can be influenced by later information. In 1995, however, eyewitness testimony remained one of the strongest investigative tools available. Detectives evaluated witness credibility through consistency, corroboration, and experience. Jurors would later be asked to do exactly the same. Standing at the crime scene during those first hours, none of the investigators could foresee that this homicide would still be discussed more than 30 years later. They could not know that disclosure failures would eventually undermine confidence in the conviction they were working toward. They could not know that another violent offender would later emerge as a possible alternative suspect. They believed they were following the evidence where it led. The challenge facing every homicide investigation is that evidence rarely speaks with a single voice. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it contradicts itself. Sometimes it remains silent until years later when forgotten reports, overlooked files, or newly appreciated forensic analysis finally reveal that the original picture was incomplete. The crime scene where Brenda Way was found offered investigators their first opportunity to understand what had happened. It also concealed the uncertainty that would follow the case for decades. The violence was unmistakable. The loss was irreversible. The urgency to solve the murder was entirely justified. Yet hidden beneath that urgency was a question that no one fully appreciated during those earliest days. Were investigators collecting evidence to discover the truth? Or were they slowly collecting evidence that would support a conclusion they had already begun to believe? That distinction would ultimately determine not only the future of Glenn Assoon but also whether Brenda Way's family would ever learn who truly ended her life on that cold November night. Every homicide investigation eventually reaches a turning point. In the earliest days, detectives gather information without knowing where it will lead. Witnesses are interviewed, forensic reports arrive, timelines are assembled, and dozens of possibilities remain open. Gradually, however, the investigation begins to narrow. Some names disappear from consideration while others move steadily toward the center of attention. Ideally, that narrowing occurs because evidence eliminates every alternative. In practice, the process can be far more complicated. In Brenda Way's case, that narrowing happened remarkably quickly. As investigators continued reviewing witness statements and Brenda's recent relationships, one individual increasingly became the primary focus of the investigation: Glenn Assoon. The reasons appeared understandable on the surface. Brenda and Glenn had previously been involved in a romantic relationship. Public records indicate that the relationship had experienced conflict. Witnesses described disagreements between the two. Several individuals reported seeing them together during the period leading up to Brenda's death. Combined with Glenn's previous criminal history, investigators believed they were looking at someone who possessed both motive and opportunity. From the perspective of experienced homicide detectives, those circumstances naturally demanded careful scrutiny. No responsible investigator would simply ignore them. The difficulty lay not in examining Glenn Assoon closely. The difficulty emerged when alternative possibilities gradually received less attention. Modern criminal investigators are often trained to remain consciously aware of confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new information in ways that reinforce existing beliefs. Once detectives begin developing confidence in a particular theory, contradictory evidence can unintentionally receive less weight while supporting evidence appears increasingly persuasive. This is not necessarily the result of bad faith. It is a deeply human way of processing information. Imagine assembling a 1,000-piece puzzle without knowing the final image. The first few pieces seem unrelated. Then several pieces connect, suggesting part of a landscape. Suddenly every new piece is examined with that landscape already in mind. Pieces that appear to fit receive immediate attention. Pieces that do not fit may be set aside while investigators continue searching for confirmation. The same psychological process can influence criminal investigations. By the weeks following Brenda's murder, detectives believed the puzzle was beginning to reveal its picture. Witness interviews occupied a central role in building that picture. Investigators spent countless hours speaking with people who had known Brenda, interacted with her during the days before her death, or possessed knowledge about her relationship with Glenn Assoon. Every conversation had the potential to clarify uncertain timelines or reveal previously unknown encounters. Eyewitness testimony has always been one of law enforcement's most valuable investigative tools. It is also among the most vulnerable to error. Human memory does not operate like a video recording. People remember emotional moments more vividly than ordinary ones. Details become sharper or blurrier depending upon later conversations. Confidence often increases over time even when accuracy does not. Researchers would later demonstrate these limitations repeatedly through scientific study, but during the mid-1990s eyewitness accounts remained a cornerstone of countless successful prosecutions. In Brenda's case, witness statements increasingly pointed investigators toward Glenn. At the same time, another important reality remained unchanged. The physical evidence still did not directly place him at the murder scene. There was no DNA identifying him as the killer. There were no fingerprints conclusively connecting him to the fatal attack. No forensic finding independently established that he had committed the crime. Consequently, the investigation depended increasingly upon indirect evidence. Circumstantial evidence should never be dismissed simply because it is indirect. Many serious criminal convictions are supported by carefully connected circumstantial facts that collectively establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. A suspect's actions before and after a crime, their relationship with the victim, their opportunity, and corroborated witness observations can create an exceptionally persuasive case. But circumstantial cases require extraordinary caution. Each individual piece may appear convincing while still allowing more than one reasonable interpretation. As investigators intensified their focus on Glenn Assoon, other avenues of inquiry remained active but gradually lost prominence. Later reviews would reveal that information existed concerning additional individuals who might have warranted closer examination. At the time, however, detectives believed they were steadily approaching the correct conclusion. The momentum of an investigation can become surprisingly powerful. Every new interview seems to support previous interviews. Every apparent confirmation strengthens investigators' confidence. Eventually the question shifts. Instead of asking, who committed this crime? The investigation may begin asking, how do we prove the suspect we already identified committed this crime? That subtle change can alter the direction of an entire case. Years later, independent examinations of Brenda Way's investigation would raise concerns that something very similar had occurred. One of the most significant developments involved information connected to alternative suspects. Subsequent reviews found that investigators possessed material concerning individuals other than Glenn Assoon whose possible relevance had not ultimately been presented to the defense. Those alternative leads became particularly important decades later when legal authorities reconsidered the integrity of the original investigation. At the time, however, none of that future controversy was visible. The investigation continued moving toward prosecution. Public attention increasingly centered upon Glenn Assoon as the likely killer. For Brenda's family, the emergence of a primary suspect may initially have appeared encouraging. Every grieving family longs for answers. An arrest offers hope that accountability may soon follow. The possibility of a trial suggests that evidence exists capable of explaining the unimaginable. Unfortunately, investigations sometimes create confidence long before certainty has truly been earned. Another significant issue involved specialized criminal intelligence. Years after the conviction, it became known that analysis conducted through Canada's Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System, commonly known as 6-class, identified similarities between Brenda's homicide and crimes associated with another violent offender. 6-class exists to identify patterns across violent crimes by comparing offender behavior, victim selection, methods of attack, and numerous other characteristics. Such analytical systems do not identify killers. They generate investigative leads. Those leads may ultimately prove significant or insignificant. Either way, they deserve careful evaluation. Information suggesting possible similarities to another violent offender was not disclosed to Glenn Assoon's defense during his trial. That omission would later become one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case. At the investigative stage, however, detectives remained convinced they were assembling a compelling case against the suspect already occupying the center of their attention. The passage of time also complicated matters. As weeks became months, witnesses naturally struggled to remember precise dates and conversations. Investigators revisited earlier interviews seeking clarification. Memories evolved. Certain details appeared stronger while others became less certain. Such changes are common in virtually every major investigation. They also illustrate why corroborating physical evidence is so valuable. Physical evidence does not forget. Witnesses sometimes do. By the time prosecutors reviewed the investigation, the narrative appeared coherent. Brenda and Glenn had experienced conflict. Witnesses placed them together. Investigators believed motive existed. No competing explanation seemed equally persuasive. The absence of direct forensic evidence did not prevent prosecutors from believing the overall case could satisfy the legal burden required for conviction. That confidence would eventually carry the investigation into the courtroom. Yet beneath the apparent strength of the prosecution's theory lay unanswered questions that would remain buried for years. Were all relevant investigative materials disclosed? Had every viable suspect been examined with equal determination? Did investigators unconsciously interpret evidence through a theory that had formed too early? Could another offender have escaped attention while detectives concentrated almost exclusively upon Glenn Assoon? Those questions would not become central until decades later. During the investigation itself, confidence overshadowed uncertainty. Looking backward from the present, it is tempting to view every missed opportunity as obvious. History rarely feels obvious while it is unfolding. Detectives worked long hours believing they were bringing a murderer to justice. Prosecutors believed the evidence supported criminal charges. Witnesses did their best to remember events from an ordinary weekend transformed by extraordinary violence. Each participant acted within a system that expected the truth to emerge through careful investigation. Yet criminal justice depends not only upon honest effort but also upon complete information. If critical evidence remains undisclosed, if alternative possibilities receive insufficient attention, or if assumptions harden into conclusions before every question has been answered, even dedicated professionals can unintentionally move an investigation away from the truth they sincerely hope to find. Brenda Way's murder investigation slowly approached that dangerous intersection. On one side stood a grieving family desperate for justice. On the other stood a suspect insisting he was innocent. Between them stood investigators convinced they had identified the right man. Years later, the Canadian justice system would be forced to ask a painful question that every homicide investigator hopes never to hear. What if the investigation solved the wrong mystery? Because identifying a suspect is only meaningful if that suspect is truly responsible. Otherwise, two tragedies unfold instead of one. An innocent person loses freedom. And the person who actually committed the murder remains beyond the reach of justice, leaving the victim's family no closer to the truth than they were on the cold November morning when Brenda Way's life came to its violent end. 4 years, the case appeared finished. Court records had been filed. Appeals had largely failed. Public attention gradually shifted toward newer crimes and newer headlines. To most people, Brenda Way's murder belonged to the past, and the man convicted of killing her would spend the rest of his life carrying the label of murderer. The criminal justice system had delivered its answer, and few expected that answer to ever change. Yet the truth has a remarkable way of refusing to disappear. Sometimes it waits quietly inside forgotten filing cabinets. Sometimes it survives in investigative reports that few people ever read. Sometimes it exists in evidence that was collected but never fully understood. And sometimes it remains hidden because no one realizes that an essential piece of the story has been left out. For Glenn Assoon, years passed behind prison walls while he continued maintaining the same position he had held from the beginning. He insisted he had not murdered Brenda Way. Claims of innocence are common among convicted offenders. Prison officials hear them every day. Courts hear them every year. Most convictions remain unchanged because the available evidence continues supporting the original verdict. Consequently, every justice system must balance two competing responsibilities. It must respect the finality of lawful convictions while remaining open to the possibility that serious mistakes occasionally occur. Wrongful convictions are exceptionally rare. But when they happen, their consequences are devastating. Not only does an innocent person lose years of freedom, but the victim's family is left believing justice has been achieved when the true offender may still remain unidentified. As time passed, lawyers and advocates working on Glenn Assoon's case continued examining the investigation that had led to his conviction. They reviewed witness testimony, police records, forensic reports, and legal disclosures with increasing attention to detail. What they gradually discovered raised questions that extended far beyond individual pieces of evidence. The questions focused on what had not been disclosed. Canadian criminal law requires prosecutors to disclose relevant evidence to the defense, including information that may assist the accused or undermine the prosecution's case. This principle exists because justice depends upon both sides having access to the information necessary to test the reliability of the evidence presented at trial. Without complete disclosure, a defense cannot effectively challenge the prosecution's theory. As lawyers revisited the Brenda Way investigation, concerns emerged that not every relevant document had been provided. Those concerns eventually became impossible to ignore. Among the undisclosed material was information relating to other possible suspects. There were investigative records suggesting that individuals besides Glenna Soon had attracted police attention during various stages of the investigation. Whether those individuals would ultimately have been proven responsible is impossible to know. What mattered was that the defense had never received information allowing it to explore those alternative possibilities before the jury. That discovery alone raised serious legal questions. But another revelation proved even more significant. Investigators had access to information generated through Canada's Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System, known as 6-Class. This specialized analytical system compares violent crimes across jurisdictions, searching for behavioral similarities that may indicate the involvement of the same offender. It does not determine guilt, but it can identify investigative leads worthy of careful examination. According to later reviews, the 6-class analysis suggested similarities between Brenda Way's murder and crimes associated with Michael Wayne McGray. McGray was no ordinary suspect. He was a convicted serial killer responsible for multiple murders across Canada. Subsequent examinations noted that he had lived near the area where Brenda was killed and that aspects of his known criminal behavior appeared sufficiently similar to warrant investigative attention. These observations did not establish that Michael Wayne McGray murdered Brenda Way. They did, however, establish that investigators possessed information pointing toward another potentially significant avenue of inquiry. The defense never received that information before Glenna Soon's trial. That omission fundamentally changed how legal authorities would later evaluate the integrity of the conviction. The breakthrough in the case did not occur because of dramatic new DNA evidence or a surprise confession. Instead, it emerged through something less cinematic but equally powerful. Paper. Documents. Reports. Disclosure records. Legal reviews. Thousands of pages examined with extraordinary patience until patterns that had once gone unnoticed slowly became impossible to dismiss. The case was no longer asking whether Glenna Soon could have committed the crime. It was asking whether he had received the fair trial guaranteed under Canadian law. That distinction transformed everything. As independent reviews continued, confidence in the original conviction steadily weakened. The concern was no longer limited to one overlooked document or one disputed witness statement. Instead, reviewers identified a broader pattern suggesting that important information had not reached the defense, preventing the jury from hearing evidence capable of influencing its assessment of reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt is the foundation of criminal justice. It does not require proving innocence. It requires proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. If undisclosed evidence could have created that doubt, then confidence in the conviction itself becomes compromised. Years after Brenda's murder, the Federal Minister of Justice exercised one of the most extraordinary powers available within Canada's legal system by ordering that Glenna Soon's conviction be reviewed. Such interventions are exceptionally uncommon. They occur only when substantial concerns arise regarding the fairness of the original proceedings. The review examined not only the conviction itself but also the investigative process that had produced it. Its findings were deeply troubling. Authorities concluded that a miscarriage of justice had likely occurred. In 2019, Glenna Soon's murder conviction was set aside. After spending nearly 17 years in prison, followed by additional years under legal restrictions, he walked out of custody no longer convicted of Brenda Way's murder. Later, prosecutors announced that they would not pursue another trial because there was no longer a reasonable prospect of conviction based upon the available evidence. For Glenna Soon, the legal victory arrived after decades that could never be returned. Birthdays had passed inside prison. Relationships had been altered forever. Years that should have belonged to ordinary life had instead been measured by prison routines, appeals, and persistent hope that someone would eventually listen. Freedom finally arrived. Time did not. For Brenda Way's family, the breakthrough created a different kind of heartbreak. For years they had believed the legal process had identified the person responsible for Brenda's death. Now that certainty disappeared. The conviction was gone. The prosecution had ended. The murder remained officially unsolved. The very development that corrected one injustice reopened another. If Glenna Soon had not killed Brenda, then who had? That question returned with renewed urgency. Attention inevitably shifted toward Michael Wayne McGray because of the previously undisclosed six-class analysis and later discussions about similarities between his known offenses and Brenda's murder. McGray's history of targeting vulnerable individuals and his presence in the broader area naturally attracted renewed scrutiny. Yet even here, caution remains essential. Although investigators and later reviewers considered him a possible alternative suspect, Michael Wayne McGray was never charged with Brenda Way's murder. No court ever determined that he committed the crime. The similarities identified through investigative analysis remained investigative leads rather than legal conclusions. The breakthrough, therefore, did not reveal the identity of Brenda's killer. It revealed something perhaps equally unsettling. The criminal justice system had become convinced of an answer without fully disclosing information that might have pointed in another direction. Sometimes breakthroughs solve mysteries. This one exposed the depth of the mystery that still remained. As news spread across Canada, the Brenda Way case gradually transformed from a local homicide into a national discussion about wrongful convictions, prosecutorial disclosure, investigative bias, and the enormous responsibility carried by every participant in the justice system. Legal experts examined disclosure obligations. Police organizations reviewed investigative practices. Journalists revisited decades-old records searching for overlooked details. Citizens asked how such a profound error could have occurred. The answers were neither simple nor comforting. There had been no single dramatic failure. Instead, numerous smaller decisions had accumulated over time until they produced one of the most consequential miscarriages of justice in Canadian history. The breakthrough reminded the country that justice is not measured solely by obtaining convictions. It is measured by reaching the correct conclusion through a process that remains fair, transparent, and open to every relevant piece of evidence. Anything less risks creating two victims instead of one. As Glenna Soon stepped back into a world that had changed dramatically during the years of his imprisonment, Brenda Way's case remained unfinished. The conviction had been overturned. The legal certainty had vanished. The questions that investigators believed they had answered in the late 1990s once again stood unanswered. Somewhere beyond thousands of pages of investigative files, courtroom transcripts, appellate decisions, and government reviews, the truth still existed. It always had. The tragedy was that after more than 2 decades of investigation, litigation, and imprisonment, the truth remained as difficult to reach as it had been on the cold November morning when Brenda Way lost her life, leaving behind a mystery that no legal ruling alone could ever resolve. Courtrooms are often described as places where truth is revealed. In reality, they are places where evidence is tested. That distinction matters because a courtroom can only evaluate the information presented before it. If critical evidence is missing, incomplete, or never disclosed, even the most conscientious judge and the most attentive jury can reach conclusions that later prove to be wrong. The story of Brenda Way's murder illustrates this difficult reality with unusual clarity. By the time Glenna Soon stood trial in 1999, investigators had spent years constructing a case they believed demonstrated his guilt. Prosecutors entered the courtroom convinced that the available evidence, viewed collectively, established that he had murdered Brenda Way. Their task was not to present every imaginable possibility but to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused was responsible for the crime. The defense approached the same evidence from the opposite direction. Its responsibility was to test every assumption, challenge every inconsistency, and remind the jury that suspicion alone could never substitute for proof. The courtroom became the place where those competing narratives met. Throughout the proceedings, prosecutors emphasized the documented relationship between Brenda and Glenn. Evidence showed that the two had known each other personally and that their relationship had experienced conflict. Witnesses described disagreements between them, and some testified that they had seen the pair together during the period preceding Brenda's death. Prosecutors argued that these facts established both motive and opportunity, encouraging jurors to view the various pieces of circumstantial evidence as parts of a single, coherent story. Each witness added another layer. Each recollection seemed to strengthen the prosecution's theory. Standing alone, individual pieces of evidence might not have appeared decisive. Together, prosecutors argued, they formed a convincing picture. The defense, however, highlighted a different aspect of the case. Despite the seriousness of the accusation, no forensic evidence directly placed Glenn Assoon at the murder scene. There was no DNA linking him to Brenda's killing. No fingerprint conclusively identified him as the person who committed the attack. The case depended primarily upon witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and the prosecution's interpretation of Brenda and Glenn's relationship. That distinction lay at the heart of the trial. Could circumstantial evidence alone satisfy the demanding legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Canadian law recognizes that it can. Many convictions have been secured without eyewitnesses or DNA because the surrounding evidence established guilt convincingly. The challenge arises when jurors must evaluate not only what evidence exists but also what evidence may be absent. Jurors rarely see the evidence that was never disclosed. They cannot weigh possibilities they never hear about. They deliberate using only the information placed before them inside the courtroom. That limitation would later become profoundly significant. After hearing testimony, reviewing exhibits, and listening to legal arguments from both sides, the jury returned its verdict. Glenn Assoon was found guilty of the second-degree murder of Brenda Way. The sentence reflected the gravity of the conviction. Life imprisonment. For Brenda's loved ones, the verdict may have appeared to bring long-awaited justice. Although no criminal conviction can restore a lost life, a guilty verdict often provides families with a sense that the legal system has identified the person responsible and held that individual accountable. It allows many to begin the slow and painful process of grieving without the uncertainty of an unresolved investigation. For Glenn Assoon, however, the verdict marked the beginning of a very different journey. From that day forward, he entered the Canadian prison system as a convicted murderer. He continued insisting that he had not killed Brenda Way. His conviction survived initial legal challenges. The case appeared settled. Yet beneath the apparent finality of the judgment, questions remained hidden from nearly everyone involved. Appeal courts generally review legal errors rather than retry entire cases. Unless new evidence emerges or serious procedural concerns are identified, convictions typically remain intact. Consequently, years passed while Glenn Assoon remained imprisoned and Brenda Way's murder was widely regarded as solved. History, however, was quietly moving in another direction. As lawyers and independent reviewers gradually uncovered undisclosed investigative materials, confidence in the original conviction began to erode. Information concerning alternative suspects, along with six-class analysis identifying similarities to crimes associated with Michael Wayne McGray, had not been provided to the defense before trial. Those omissions fundamentally altered the legal landscape. The issue was no longer whether jurors had acted improperly. There is no indication that they had. Jurors reached their verdict using the evidence available to them. The deeper question became whether they had been given all the relevant information necessary to reach a fully informed decision. Justice depends upon that completeness. When critical information remains undisclosed, the fairness of the proceeding itself comes into question regardless of anyone's intentions. Years after the conviction, the federal review process examined precisely those concerns. The resulting conclusions carried enormous weight. Authorities determined that serious failures in disclosure and investigation had undermined confidence in the conviction. The legal system that had once declared the case resolved was now acknowledging that its own process had likely failed. In 2019, Glenna Soon's conviction was officially quashed. The judgment that had once appeared final no longer stood. Soon afterward, prosecutors announced that they would not pursue a new trial because there was no longer a reasonable prospect of securing a conviction based upon the available evidence. This decision did not identify another killer. It did not determine who murdered Brenda Way. Instead, it recognized that the original conviction could no longer be considered reliable. Legally, the case had returned to uncertainty. Emotionally, the consequences were even more complicated. For Glenna Soon, freedom arrived after nearly 17 years in prison. The world he returned to had changed dramatically. Technology, society, and everyday life had evolved while he remained incarcerated. Time lost to wrongful imprisonment cannot be restored through legal decisions or financial compensation. It remains one of the most irreversible forms of injustice a justice system can produce. For Brenda Way's family, the legal reversal reopened wounds that had never completely healed. The conviction that once represented certainty had disappeared. The person they had been told was responsible was no longer legally considered guilty. The question they believed had been answered now stood before them once again. Who killed Brenda? That question remains unresolved. The courtroom battles ultimately produced two different verdicts separated by 20 years. The first declared that Glenna Soon was guilty. The second concluded that the legal system could no longer support that conclusion. Between those two judgments lies an extraordinary lesson about the limits of criminal justice. Courtrooms do not possess magical access to the truth. They rely upon investigators to collect evidence thoroughly. They rely upon prosecutors to disclose that evidence completely. They rely upon witnesses to remember honestly. They rely upon defense counsel to challenge assumptions. They rely upon judges to safeguard fairness. And they rely upon juries to evaluate everything placed before them with extraordinary care. When every part of that system functions properly, justice becomes possible. When critical information fails to reach the courtroom, even sincere participants can unintentionally contribute to an unjust result. The Brenda Way case demonstrates that convictions are not the ultimate measure of justice. Accuracy is. A conviction secured without complete disclosure may satisfy society's desire for closure while leaving the truth undiscovered. Likewise, overturning a wrongful conviction corrects one injustice without necessarily solving the original crime. That painful paradox defines this case. The courtroom ultimately delivered two important decisions. One was wrong. The other corrected that wrong. Neither answered the question that mattered most to Brenda Way's family. As the legal proceedings came to an end, the criminal justice system acknowledged that it had failed one man. Whether it had also failed one murdered woman by never identifying the person truly responsible remained an unanswered question, one that continues to cast a shadow over every courtroom transcript, every investigative report, and every legal ruling connected to this extraordinary case. In the end, the most powerful lesson from the courtroom was not about victory or defeat. It was about humility. Every participant in the justice system must recognize that certainty should always be earned through complete evidence rather than assumed through persuasive narratives. Because once a verdict is returned, lives continue long after the courtroom doors close, and if the wrong conclusion has been reached, those lives may carry the consequences for decades while the truth waits patiently, unheard, somewhere beyond the record of the trial itself. Some cases end with a conviction. Others end with an acquittal. A few remain permanently unsolved. The murder of Brenda Way belongs to an even smaller and more unsettling category. It is a case that delivered a conviction, later lost that conviction, and still has no one legally responsible for the death of the woman whose life was taken. That is why, decades after the events of November 1995, the story continues to be discussed not only in courtrooms and law schools but also among investigators, journalists, legal scholars, and ordinary Canadians who continue asking how such a sequence of events could have unfolded. For Brenda Way's family, the passage of time has never erased the central fact that brought all of this into motion. Brenda never came home. Every legal review, every appeal, every government investigation, and every public discussion exists because one violent crime permanently changed the lives of the people who loved her. As years passed, birthdays continued without her. Family gatherings included an empty place that could never truly be filled. New generations grew up hearing about someone they never had the chance to know. The pain of homicide rarely fades completely. Instead, it becomes woven into everyday life, quietly accompanying the people left behind. The overturning of Glenna Soon's conviction did not lessen that grief. If anything, it created another layer of uncertainty. Families of homicide victims often say that not knowing can be almost as painful as knowing. When a case appears solved, however imperfectly, many begin building their lives around the belief that justice has at least identified the person responsible. When that certainty disappears years later, the emotional consequences can be profound. The past suddenly becomes unsettled again. Questions that seemed resolved return with even greater force. If Glenna Soon did not kill Brenda, then who did? That question remains unanswered. Following the review that led to Soon's exoneration, authorities in Nova Scotia undertook broader examinations of how the investigation had been handled. These reviews reflected an understanding that correcting a wrongful conviction requires more than acknowledging the mistake. Institutions must also examine why the mistake occurred so that similar failures become less likely in the future. No criminal justice system is perfect. Investigators work under pressure. Witnesses make honest mistakes. Prosecutors manage enormous responsibilities. Judges and juries must reach decisions using the information available to them. Because every participant is human, every justice system carries the possibility of error. Recognizing that reality does not weaken public confidence. Ignoring it does. One of the enduring lessons from the Brenda Way case concerns disclosure. Modern criminal justice depends upon the principle that prosecutors must provide the defense with relevant information, including evidence that may weaken the prosecution's own case. This obligation exists not because prosecutors should help defendants escape responsibility, but because the ultimate purpose of a criminal trial is to discover the truth through a fair process. Justice is not a competition. It is a search. When important information remains undisclosed, intentionally or unintentionally, that search becomes incomplete. Another equally important lesson involves investigative openness. Detectives naturally develop theories as evidence accumulates. Without working theories, investigations would struggle to move forward. Yet every theory must remain flexible enough to accommodate new information, even when that information challenges earlier assumptions. The Brenda Way investigation demonstrates the danger of allowing one narrative to become dominant before every reasonable possibility has been explored. This does not necessarily mean that investigators acted with malicious intent. The official reviews instead highlighted systemic failures involving disclosure and investigative decision-making that ultimately undermined confidence in the conviction. Those findings have influenced conversations throughout Canada's legal community regarding best practices for major investigations. The case also serves as a reminder of the remarkable importance of independent review. Had lawyers, journalists, and others stopped asking difficult questions after the conviction, Glenna Soon might never have been exonerated. His case illustrates why appellate courts, innocence organizations, investigative journalism, and ministerial reviews all play essential roles within democratic justice systems. Finality has value. Accuracy has greater value. A justice system unwilling to revisit possible mistakes risks preserving errors indefinitely. At the same time, the Brenda Way case reminds us that correcting one injustice does not automatically resolve another. Brenda's murder remains officially unsolved. No court has determined who ended her life. Although later reviews identified Michael Wayne McGray as a possible alternative suspect based on investigative information and behavioral similarities noted through 6th class, he was never charged with Brenda's murder, and no legal finding established that he was responsible. Any discussion of his possible involvement therefore remains exactly what investigators treated it as, a possible lead rather than a proven conclusion. That distinction matters. True justice requires evidence, not speculation. Replacing one unsupported certainty with another would only repeat the very mistakes that transformed this case into a miscarriage of justice. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Brenda Way's story is that two separate truths now exist side by side. The first is beyond dispute. Brenda Way was murdered. The second is equally clear. The man once convicted of her murder was later exonerated after serious concerns emerged regarding the fairness of the investigation and prosecution. Everything beyond those two facts remains uncertain. Somewhere between them lies the answer that investigators sought in 1995 and that Brenda's family still deserves today. There is another lesson hidden within this case, one that extends beyond police work and courtrooms into the broader way societies remember victims of crime. When wrongful convictions are uncovered, public attention often shifts almost entirely toward the individual who was wrongly imprisoned. That attention is understandable because such cases reveal profound institutional failures. Yet we should never allow those discussions to eclipse the victim whose death began the entire process. Brenda Way should not be remembered only as the victim in a wrongful conviction case. She should be remembered as a woman whose life was taken through an act of violence that remains unresolved. Her name deserves to stand independently from the legal controversy that followed. Likewise, Glenna Soon's story should not be viewed merely as an administrative error corrected through legal procedure. Nearly 17 years of imprisonment cannot be restored. Time does not return. Families cannot relive birthdays that were missed. Careers cannot recover years that never existed. Every wrongful conviction leaves permanent consequences extending far beyond the courtroom. The tragedy of this case is therefore measured in more than one life. One life ended violently. Another lost decades to imprisonment. One family continued grieving without definitive answers. Another watched a loved one maintain his innocence while remaining behind bars. And an entire justice system was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about its own safeguards. These are not isolated human stories. They are deeply connected. As we reach the end of this journey, it becomes tempting to search for a satisfying conclusion, a final revelation that explains every unanswered question and restores balance to the narrative. Real life rarely offers such endings. Sometimes investigations remain open. Sometimes evidence disappears forever. Sometimes the person responsible is never identified with the certainty required by law. The absence of closure does not diminish the importance of continuing to seek the truth. If anything, it makes that search even more necessary. Today, the murder of Brenda Way remains officially unsolved. Her family continues hoping that one day new evidence, renewed investigation, or previously overlooked information may finally reveal what happened during those missing hours in November 1995. Whether that day will ever come remains unknown. What is known is that this case has already changed Canadian criminal justice in meaningful ways. It has strengthened discussions about disclosure obligations. It has reinforced the importance of reviewing potential wrongful convictions. It has reminded investigators of the dangers of premature certainty. And it has shown that protecting the rights of the accused ultimately protects the integrity of justice itself. Because justice is never served by convicting the wrong person. Doing so creates only the illusion of resolution while allowing the original crime to remain unsolved. Brenda Way deserved a complete and unbiased investigation. Glenna Soon deserved a fair trial based upon full disclosure of the available evidence. Canadian society deserved confidence that its justice system would pursue truth above all else. The painful history of this case reminds us that those three goals are inseparable. We cannot truly honor victims by lowering the standards of fairness. We cannot protect the innocent by ignoring the suffering of victims' families. And we cannot preserve public trust unless every investigation remains willing to question its own assumptions whenever new evidence demands it. Perhaps that is the lasting legacy of Brenda Way's story. It is not simply a cautionary tale about wrongful convictions or investigative mistakes. It is a reminder that justice is not a destination reached when a verdict is announced. It is an ongoing commitment to humility, transparency, and truth. Sometimes that commitment requires admitting painful errors. Sometimes it requires reopening cases long believed to be finished. And sometimes it requires accepting that the most honest answer, however unsatisfying, is that we still do not know exactly what happened. Until that answer is found, Brenda Way's story remains unfinished. Not because people have stopped searching, but because the truth, despite decades of investigation, legal battles, and public scrutiny, is still waiting to be fully uncovered. Nearly 3 decades have passed since Brenda Way lost her life on a cold November night in Dartmouth, yet the passage of time has answered remarkably few of the questions that mattered most. The streets have changed. Buildings have been renovated. Businesses have opened and closed. New families have moved into neighborhoods that once formed the backdrop of one of Canada's most controversial criminal cases. Children who were not even born in 1995 now walk those same sidewalks without realizing that history lingers quietly beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life. Time has transformed almost everything except the mystery itself. For investigators, an unsolved homicide never truly disappears. Even after years pass, files remain stored inside police archives. Physical evidence, if preserved properly, continues to exist. Witness statements remain available for review. Advances in forensic science occasionally breathe new life into cases once believed impossible to solve. Every technological breakthrough raises hope that an overlooked clue may finally reveal what decades of investigation could not. The murder of Brenda Way continues to exist within that uncertain space between history and possibility. Officially, the case has never been closed by identifying another offender. Officially, no one now stands convicted of taking Brenda's life. Officially, investigators continue to acknowledge that the murder remains unsolved. For Brenda's family, those official statements cannot replace certainty. Every family affected by homicide eventually develops 2 calendars. One follows the ordinary progression of years marked by birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and changing seasons. The other begins on the day everything changed. Every year contains another November. Every November brings another reminder that time continues moving while grief quietly refuses to obey the calendar. People often imagine grief as something that gradually becomes smaller. In reality, life usually becomes larger around it. The grief remains. People simply learn how to carry it. For those who knew Brenda, memories become increasingly valuable because they are among the few things untouched by legal decisions. Court rulings may change. Convictions may be overturned. Investigations may be reopened. Public opinion may shift dramatically over time. Personal memories, however, remain deeply human. They preserve the person rather than the case. That distinction deserves attention because true crime stories sometimes unintentionally reduce victims to evidence. Brenda Way was never merely a file number. She was never simply the victim in a miscarriage of justice. She was a human being whose future ended long before it should have. Her story deserves to be remembered with that understanding. The same compassion extends toward those whose lives were permanently altered by the wrongful conviction of Glenn Assoon. When Canada acknowledged that a miscarriage of justice had occurred, it did more than overturn a conviction. It recognized that the justice system itself possesses an extraordinary responsibility. Courts have the power to remove a person's freedom. Because that power is so immense, every safeguard protecting fairness becomes equally important. Disclosure is not a technical legal requirement. It is a promise that justice values truth above victory. Independent review is not an inconvenience. It is recognition that human beings, no matter how experienced or well-intentioned, remain capable of error. Questioning previous conclusions is not a sign of weakness. It is often the strongest evidence that a justice system is committed to improving itself. The Brenda Way case continues to be studied because it demonstrates how easily certainty can become dangerous when it arrives before every relevant fact has been examined. The investigation reminds us that evidence should shape theories. Theories should never shape evidence. That lesson extends far beyond criminal investigations. It applies whenever human beings make important decisions based upon incomplete information. Whether in courtrooms, workplaces, classrooms, or everyday life, Assumptions have remarkable influence over perception. Once people become convinced they understand a situation, contradictory information often becomes more difficult to recognize. Justice demands the opposite. Justice requires remaining willing to ask one more question, to review one more document, to reconsider one more possibility, to admit when previous conclusions no longer withstand careful examination. Those principles cannot restore Brenda Way's life. They cannot return the years Glenn Assoon lost. They cannot erase the pain carried by either family. What they can do is reduce the likelihood that history will repeat itself. Perhaps that is the most meaningful legacy left by this difficult story. It is not found in a courtroom verdict. It is not found in newspaper headlines. It is found in the quiet determination to build a justice system that values accuracy over speed, transparency over certainty, and truth over convenience. Somewhere, the complete story of what happened during Brenda Way's final hours still exists. Whether that story will ever be fully uncovered remains unknown. But the search itself continues to matter. Because every unsolved homicide represents an unfinished promise. A promise made to the victim that their life will not be forgotten. A promise made to their family that the search for answers will not simply end because time has passed. And a promise made to society that justice is measured not by how quickly a case appears solved, but by how faithfully the truth is pursued, no matter how difficult, uncomfortable, or uncertain that pursuit may become. The story of Brenda Way ultimately asks every listener to remember one simple but profound idea. The purpose of justice is never to protect a verdict. It is to protect the truth. Only when those two remain inseparable can the memory of victims be honored, the innocent be protected, and public trust in the justice system endure for generations to come.